So today I want to talk about Minnesota Police and Line 3. At this point, it should be well understood that we are in a climate crisis. With all the extreme weather events that have occurred in just this past year alone, and the IPCC reports that are predicting that things are going to get a lot worse in the near future, it should be quite evident that we need to stop producing more fossil fuels. And as I've talked about before, the Biden administration has done nothing to reverse course on this. As a matter of fact, he's actually increased drilling projects despite his words of stating how grave the situation actually is and his promises to reduce exactly that. As usual, the interest is in protecting large corporations and capital because that will always take precedent under our current economic system over the needs of people. This is, of course, evidenced by the Minnesota Police's response to the water protectors, who are defending sacred water like that of the Mississippi River, a source of drinking water, mind you, which will undoubtedly be polluted by an oil spill if this line actually does get built. If anyone had any doubts that the Minnesota Police, like all police departments, are responsible for the protection of property and capital over that of people, they have actually received a healthy amount of financial support from Enbridge, the company responsible for building Line 3. They are the enforcers for private interests who continue to build this climate-destroying project through indigenous lands. So to start us off on examining this, I want to take a look at an article from Gizmodo first and foremost. We have here that Amazon's former security chief is now guarding the Line 3 oil pipeline. Opponents of oil transport company Enbridge say that the company is using military-style counterinsurgency tactics against protesters. The man heading up security for the oil transport company Enbridge, which is currently facing down an indigenous-led protest movement against Line 3 pipeline, formerly helped Exxon shield its operations from demonstrations in Nigeria and oversaw global security for Amazon. Enbridge's head of security, Troy Kirby, likely built a handbook of the kind of corporate counterinsurgency tactics experts say energy companies have applied towards environmental activists in recent years. So this is who's leading the project of Line 3, someone who has helped oversee a operation in Nigeria and who has provided global security for Amazon. On top of that, some of the lessons that Kirby may have brought to helping Enbridge build Line 3 in Minnesota include payments to local police forces for their role in keeping protesters from interfering with construction. Enbridge has also trained the police and receives invites to police intelligence meetings where the details of local activists are discussed and shared between agencies. So this private company and this police department are working hand in hand to discover the location of activists, to talk about details about them, and to work together to protect this pipeline and protect the property involved, even though these activists are the ones working to protect the climate and the environment. They are the ones that are being targeted, and it is a combination of this police force and this private company. They are working in tandem, they are working hand in hand, and they should be recognized as the police protecting the private interests of this corporation. Local agencies such as the Aitkin County Sheriff's Office have aggressively monitored social media activity by prominent activists in order to rack up evidence for charges. The Minnesota Public Utilities Commission has set up a special Enbridge-funded escrow account to pay for the time and equipment of local authorities protecting Line 3. Kirby also assured a local sheriff that Enbridge wielded influence over who would become the public official in charge of determining reimbursements, meaning that Kirby, who's in charge of the security at the company that is building Line 3, influenced a local sheriff election to determine who would be paying them being paid the reimbursements, meaning that there's a little bit of collusion going on, a little bit of conflict of interest here, as we might say. Now, it's worth noting as well that Enbridge Line 3 security lead Brian Aldrich is also a former Marine who bounced around major security firms and was once part of CEO Jeff Bezos' security detail. And Securitas, the company that owns Pinkerton, is also one of Line 3's primary private security providers. And yes, that is the same Pinkerton that we know about from the Homestead protests and riots, as they're called, in Allegheny County, that were responsible for defending Carnegie and his business there. Meanwhile, even Gizmodo points out that new oil and gas exploration must end next year to protect us from the worst impacts of climate change. Indigenous-led movements have been incredibly effective at turning the tide, but it's clear oil and as but it's clear oil and as companies are pulling out all the stops to keep fossil fuels flowing. So yeah, even Gizmodo here is pointing that out. But when we look into more details from The Intercept, talking about exactly what's going into that funding, a Minnesota sheriff's office has requested that tar sands pipeline company Enbridge reimburse the department for nearly $72,000 worth of riot gear and more than $10,000 in, quote, less than lethal weapons and ammunition, including tear gas, pepper spray, beanbag and sponge rounds, flashbang devices, and batons. The Sheriff's Office of Beltrami County, which sits at the center of an Indigenous-led fight to stop the construction of Enbridge's Line 3 pipeline replacement project, labeled weapons as, quote, personal protective equipment. So we can't get proper PPE in hospitals and in a lot of schools to be able to protect kids from a virus, but there's more than enough money for these private interest companies to provide all of these defensive equipment and PPE to the sheriff of this county, which of course includes things like tear gas and pepper spray and sponge rounds and beanbags and flashbang devices and batons, which are clearly used as weapons, and they are not, quote, less than lethal. A lot of those hurt, and a lot of those can cause long-term damage. The Minnesota Public Utilities Commission is responsible for maintaining the escrow account set up so that Enbridge can reimburse public safety agencies for expenses associated with Line 3 construction, especially costs for policing protests. I don't think by any stretch of the imagination batons could be considered PPE or grenades, said one person who's against Line 3. For nearly a decade, the Anishinaabe organizers have fought to stop Line 3, which passes through their treaty lands and traditional territory. Enbridge is replacing a deteriorating pipeline with a new, higher capacity line that would allow the struggling tar sands industry of Alberta, Canada, to more cheaply send its oil to a transport hub in Wisconsin, and then onto refineries on the Gulf Coast. Opponents point to the spill risk of the project, which poses to damage more than 200 streams and 700 acres of wetland, as well as the fact that tar sands oil is one of the world's worst fossil fuels for the climate. One researcher found that the project's annual carbon output would be the equivalent of 50 coal-fired power plants. So just to put this in context, this is what's being defended by the police here. It is a company that is responsible for a climate disaster that would be the equivalent of creating 50 coal-fired power plants. And the company is basically paying for their riot gear and all of this military-grade equipment that they can use to stop protesters who want to make sure that 200 streams, 700 acres of wetland, and the Mississippi River are protected. That's what we're talking about here. That is the dividing line. The company here and their police force that they have paid for are not protecting anybody but the private interests of this company to make financial gains off of the destruction of the land and the climate. And of course, they will never be seen as that way by the state, who upholds and supports all this. You know, the invoices are showing all of this purchasing of literal riot gear that has gone back since 2016, when the sheriff of Beltrami County saw everything that was happening with the Dakota Access Pipeline in North Dakota, where they also used water hoses, tear gas, and other, quote, less than lethal weapons. And this is what's being done to protesters. In the meantime, recently, nearly 900 people have been arrested during protests against the Line 3 oil pipeline, which of course is being built in northern Minnesota. Most were cited with misdemeanors, but many, like this one person, Stovall, had been charged with gross misdemeanors, and some face felony charges. And of course, with what we know about the intel being paid for and collaborated with this company, that means that the protesters involved are having their accounts looked into to find how high they can make these charges go. And they're specifically targeting individuals before they even enter the protests. So they know who to look out for, they know who their targets are, and they know who they're arresting. So we also have this information here. the violence that has been incited in what is increasingly becoming the Deep North has come from law enforcement's Northern Lights Task Force, which has been overreaching in its tactics and its arrests of nonviolent protesters. To date, there have been more than 800 arrests. As we pointed out, there are about 900. This is coming from a slightly earlier article. Line 3 opponents have reported being brutalized by rubber bullets, chemical sprays, and, quote, pain compliance. Now, pain compliance should be understood as using joints or pressure points in order to inflict pain to get people to respond. It is quite torturous and quite painful. There are certain pressure points that are used, and we'll talk about that briefly in a moment. But that is what's being used in order to stop peaceful protesters. These actions have actually risen to the attention of the United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination for violations of the Anishinaabe human rights from Enbridge Line 3. So yeah, Enbridge is basically paying these police forces to inflict pain compliance, use chemical sprays and rubber bullets, and they're providing a service for that. So the cops are literally the enforcers of private interest in this regard and are using brutal tactics to make sure that they can eliminate and push away as many protesters as possible. Those who are going to stick to their guns and are going to stay on the picket line, as it were, are going to be arrested and be charged with large misdemeanors that will be having great effect on their records, as well as felony charges. In the meantime, I'm going to show a brief clip here provided to us by More Perfect Union that talks about how the police are using pain compliance techniques on water protectors. To remove the activists from the pipeline protests, cops are digging into pressure points, i.e. the side of the neck, and that is what is occurring. So I'm going to show a brief section of this clip, but I do implore you to go seek the rest of it. This is from a Twitter account, Resist Line 3.
They basically hold you in a headlock and then focused first on a pressure point that's right below my ear, forced his thumb in there for probably 30 to 45 seconds.
So he like grabbed the left side of my head, and with his other hand, he just like started pressing in right below this ear, and just like started getting harder and harder and harder. And it like I could feel my eardrum, like the pressure start building here. And it was like right on the nerve, so it really hurt, and I started screaming.
He was pushing so hard into my nasal cavity that my nasal airways were completely blocked. I don't think I was getting enough oxygen, but there was another sheriff's deputy standing there. And I could feel that my right side of my face wasn't working anymore.
First he put me in a headlock, and then he proceeded pressing really hard with his fingers here and sort of moving them up and down and sideways. As somebody who has given birth, the level of pain was like beyond that.
So that is the extent of what I wanted to show, just how brutal these tactics are, and the idea that they're being compared to torture is quite realistic here. The fact of the matter is that they are using tactics that are considered absolutely brutal and are inflicting pain that, as that one person stated, was worse than giving birth. Now, in the meantime, I want to point out that this is also the same police. Maybe not the exact same department, I'm not 100% sure on that, but it's the same police in the same state that had surrounded water protectors at a ceremony they had in front of the Minnesota State Capitol. And on screen, you can see one such image of what looks like at least 100 police officers literally standing in front of and threatening to protect water protectors during a ceremony. And I have another shot of it on screen as well that has a better angle to show you just how many police officers were actually there. Now, I need to compare this to something. And this is a rally that had occurred the next day where opponents to the COVID vaccine mandates had rallied outside the exact same Capitol. And there's no signs of police pretty much anywhere. As far as I could gauge, there was one police officer, and I had to thumb through to find that officer within the photos. Just literally on screen, one officer for all those people. Where's the surrounding happening there? The fact of the matter is that these anti-vaccine mandate protesters were largely all white, and they were largely a group that was not attacking the status quo and not attacking capital. In fact, I'd argue that they were more of a threat to people and were probably doing more damage, but it wasn't to capital, it was to people. And that should be the evidence, all the evidence that we really need here. It really is disturbing just how many people were at this protest compared to the other one that we saw. And there's maybe one police officer that I can find an image of. In the meantime, there were hundreds around the ceremony for the water protectors. And this all occurs on the same day, and this just got me completely angry. It's not related, but I do need to point this out. This is the same day, if we're talking about Minnesota police, this is the same day where Derek Chauvin has appealed for the conviction of the murder of George Floyd. And maybe this isn't the same section of Minnesota, but it's still in Minnesota. And if we're talking about Minnesota police, we need to talk about this just briefly. This is the person who murdered George Floyd. This is the person responsible for that. If nobody else was, if none of the other officers got charged, him being charged was that like one thing that people could look at and say, well, at least that happened. At least that was the response, even though it was far inadequate and not enough at all. And now he's appealing the conviction. And I'm really afraid that he's going to get off and that a lot of the energy around this is just going to fall to the wayside, and that's just what's going to happen. And in the meantime, it's quite apparent in all of this that the Minnesota police are upholding capital and property rights over people, as their job has truly always been. They are literally being funded by a private corporation to protect this pipeline that poses an environmental and climate risk and violates the treaty rights of the Anishinaabe people. Meanwhile, the water protectors that are standing up to this corporation are being targeted, both before and during protests, while the state and police are acting on the behest of Enbridge and working in tandem, because the connections between corporate interests, government interests, and the police are quite evident at this point, and none of them care about the climate, or people, or treaty rights. So with that said, if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button and the bell for notifications. You can follow me on Twitter and check out my Discord on the description down below. My name is Anarchist Tara, and I thank you for watching.